Hi, now we've learnt roughly how figured bass works, we're going to try an exercise, first of all, that's on the lines of the kind of thing you're asked to do in grade 6 theory. And on the board you can see that I've got a melody, and underneath I've started to write a bass line, and there's some figuring in the bass as well. Then underneath the stave we've got a whole series of asterisks. So the task that we're going to try and complete now, which you might be asked to do in a grade 6 theory exam, is to complete the bass line and also to come up with any figures that you think might be needed to figure the bass line and indicate which chords we're going to use. So the first thing we might just notice is what's the material that we've got? Well, we're in B flat major, and if we're not in B flat major we must be in G minor, but as I look through the piece I can't see any accidentals at all. There's a B flat at the end as well, which is another pointer. That's probably confirming that we're in B flat major. We've also got two 4-bar phrases, and that implies something important, which is that a phrase wants to finish with a cadence. So we're going to need to think about what the cadence is here and what the cadence is at the end. And the temptation with this kind of exercise is just to get to work on the very next note that needs a bass note and a figure and see if somehow we can get to the end. But actually there's a lot of sense in planning the cadences. Just before we do that, let's have a look at the given couple of bars to see if we can work out what's going on there. So here's our melodic line, here's the bass line that goes with it. You'll notice things like in the second bar there's contramotion between the top and the bottom. You know, the given line is going up, the bottom line is coming down. That's often a good way to write a bass line. If you have too much of the bass line going in the same direction as the melody line, you soon bump into problems. And we've another session which is outlining the basic rules of writing harmony, of writing chords, and in that you'll discover all sorts of information about consecutive fifths and consecutive octaves and so on. If we've got the bass line going in the same direction as the melody all the time, we're much more likely to have problems with consecutive fifths and consecutive octaves. Now you can't always write it in contramotion, but if there's a sense of that going on during the piece, it's probably quite helpful. And you can already see it happening in that second bar. Even in the first bar, you can see there's a bit of contramotion, looking at the two notes at the end of the bar. From the first note to the second note, the melody is going down by step, but the bass is leaping. So if the one part's going by step and the other part's leaping, that's also going to get you away from the problem that you might have with consecutive fifths and consecutive octaves. Now, if the figuring is blank, we've already discovered that that means 5-3 is the chord. In other words, a root position chord. So we've got a root position chord here, a 5-3, a root position chord here, another 5-3, a root position chord here, another 5-3. So if you wanted to think about this in Roman numerals, you can see that because we've got B flat in the bass line here, and it's a 5-3 chord, it's a root position chord. So B flat must be at the bottom of the chord. So it's B flat, D and F. And you can see that this D in the melody is in fact one of those notes. So that's a 5-3 chord that we might in Roman numerals also call chord 1. The next chord is another 5-3 chord. It's a root position chord built on F. So that should be F, A, C. You can see the C is there in the melody. So we could call that in Roman numerals chord 5. But F, A, C is chord 5. It's also a 5-3 chord built on F. The next chord is another 5-3 chord built on G this time. So this chord is G, B flat, because B flat's in the key signature, and D. So here's the G in the bass, we've got a B flat in the melody, and of course it will be down to the continuo player, the harpsichordist or the organist, to insert the missing note. So if we've got a G there, then the continuo player would be playing a G, but would also be looking for a B flat and a D to complete this chord. When we get to bar 2, you'll notice we've started to move away from the 5/3 chords. And remember that 6 is an abbreviation. It's an abbreviation of 6/3. And 6/3 is always a first inversion chord. So in other words, this E flat in the bass, if this is a first inversion chord, this E flat must be the third of the triad. So the triad must be C, E flat, G. And you can see the C is there in the melody part. So in B flat major, C, E flat, G would be chord 2. But because the E flat's in the bass, the third of that chord's in the bass, in Roman numerals we'd call that chord 2B. First inversion chord in figured bass is a 6/3 chord, but we're abbreviating 6/3 to 6. Now, the dash that comes after the 6 is telling us to carry on using this chord. Even though the bass line has moved to another note and the melody's off somewhere else as well, we're going to hang on to the same chord. Now, it's up to the continuo player at the keyboard to decide whether just to put down a chord here and sustain it while the next note is played, or whether just to rearrange the notes of this chord as we move on to the next one. That's entirely up to the player to decide. So that's what's going on there. Then we've got another 5/3 chord at the end of the bar. So it's built on C, C, E flat, G, known in Roman numerals as chord 2 in B flat major. C, the E flat's in the top there, the continuo player would be looking to supply the G as well, probably. So that's what we've got so far, and it gives us the lie of the land. And now we've got to go on and decide what we're going to do in the bass line for the rest of it, and make sure we've got figures for each of these asterisks down below. Well, you might want to start with a very final cadence right at the end, because this B flat, if we're in B flat major, there's a very good chance we're going to finish on chord 1, on the tonic chord. So the tonic chord in B flat major will be B flat, D and F. So it's probably fairly safe to put a B flat in the bass line. So let's do that. Don't forget that anything we write, you can always change later if we think of a good reason to come up with something else, which is why it's a very good idea to do these answers in pencil, so you have a rubber at hand to modify things as you go. Well, if it's finishing on a chord 1 with B flat in the bass, this means that we've only got 2 possible cadences, because there are only 2 cadences that finish on the tonic chord. It could be a perfect cadence, or it could be a plagal cadence. Well, if it's a plagal cadence, going 4 followed by 1, the notes of chord 4 in B flat major are E flat, G, B flat. Well, we've got A in the melody. It doesn't seem to belong to E flat, G, B flat at all, so I don't think it's going to be a plagal cadence. Let's look at chord 5. In B flat major, chord 5 is going to be F, A, C. Now then, we've got A in the melody, so this is looking very possible, isn't it? So it could be that we're looking for an F there, and that we're looking for another 5/3 chord. So we've already got the last 2 chords in place. Now the F could be here, it could be an octave higher. We can keep an open mind on that for the time being if we want to. Now, when you're putting in a cadence, once you've got the cadence secure as we have now, you might just want to think about the chord that comes before the cadence. It's what we call the approach chord. It's the chord approaching the cadence. B flat in the melody. Well, we've already discovered, haven't we, that B flat's at the end, and so it's implying a chord 1. But remember that any note you have signals 3 possible chords, because any given note is the root of one chord, it's the third of another chord, and it's the fifth of another chord. Let's have a little think about this. We've got B flat. So B flat is the root of chord 1. It's also the middle, the third, of chord 6. And it's also the top, or the fifth, of a chord 4. So we could go 1, 5, 1. But maybe that's going to be a little bit, 1, 5, come back to 1. We could go 4, 5, 1. That would be quite strong, wouldn't it? We could go 6, 5, 1. All 3 are perfectly possible. If you go 6, 5, 1, you're going to have the bass line moving in the same direction as the melody. Sometimes that's perfectly okay, but bear in mind what we said earlier. Once we're moving in the same direction and by the same interval, there's a good chance we'll end up with some consecutive trouble somewhere down the line. So we might decide that we're not going to go for that particular option. Another possibility, however, is that we could use chord 1 in a different inversion. And I'm just going to suggest this possibility. It's not the only possibility, but have a think about this one. And if I put 6, 4 under here, you'll remember from our earlier lesson that 6, 4 means second inversion. So let's have a little look at what we've now written. We've got F in the bass, but 6, 4's telling us that this is a second inversion chord. So F is the fifth of the chord. So we've got F in the bass, the third then must be D, and the root must be B flat. So hopefully you can see that B flat D F is chord 1, but by putting the F in the bass, we've turned our chord 1 into a second inversion of chord 1. It's a 1C chord. And in fact, the progression that we've now got at the end is a very common progression. 1C, 5, 1. And it makes for a nice strong cadence. There's nothing to stop you going 4, 5, 1. So if you were happier to do that, that would be fine. The great thing about these kind of exercises at this level is that there isn't one single right answer. There are various possibilities. So as long as we come on one that works well for us, all is fine. But this sort of bass, what I call the hot cross bun bass, hot cross buns, that goes dominant, dominant, tonic, and that's a 6-4, 5-3, 5-3. So see how that works. It's called 1C, chord 5, followed by chord 1. So that gives us the last 3 chords. Now maybe this is a good time to have a look at the cadence at the end of the first phrase. See if we can get some notes in here. But all the time we're looking at the melody, just have a look and see what you think is going on. We're asked to put a chord in the last beat of this bar. It's the last minim beat of the bar because we're in 3-2. So we've got 2 crotchets here, and it's worth just thinking about what's going on there. The D is on the beat, the C comes after the beat, and it anticipates the following note. So this C, the last crotchet of the bar, is an anticipatory note. In other words, it's one of those inessential notes. It doesn't belong to this chord. Having sounded this chord, the C anticipates the C that comes in the next bar. So we're not going to worry about finding a chord that fits with this C because it's an inessential note. We're going to find a chord that fits with this D and then a chord that fits with this C. Maybe it's easier to start with a C because that's going to help us discover what kind of cadence we're dealing with. Well, if it was going to be a perfect or a plagal cadence, then we'd need this note to fit with chord 1. Chord 1 is B flat, D, F, and there's no C in it, so it can't possibly be perfect or plagal, which means that it must be imperfect or interrupted. If it's imperfect, we're going to need a chord 5 here. If it's interrupted, we're going to need a chord 6. Let's look at chord 6 first. Now in B flat major, chord 6 is G, B flat, D, no sign of C, so it can't be that. Chord 5, however, in B flat major is F, A, C. Aha, C, that's useful. So this can only be a chord 5 because it's a cadence, and we now know that it's going to have to be an imperfect cadence. So I'm going to put an F in the bass line. As it's the cadence point, we don't want the music to be charging around, we just want it to settle at that point. And if it's an F-A-C chord, chord 5 in root position, then obviously we don't need any figures because it's a 5-3 chord. Now then, let's step back, because now we know this is an imperfect cadence. We know the chord before it will have to be 1 or 2 or 4, because that's the pattern for an imperfect cadence. Well, let's explore those possibilities. D is the given note, that's the harmony note. If we have chord 2 in B flat major, that will throw up C, E flat and G. Well, there's no D in that, so that's not going to work. If we're going to have chord 4, that would be E flat, G, B flat. Well, there's no D in that, is there? We could conceivably think that if we had a chord 4, the D could make it a 4-7 chord, so that's not beyond the bounds of possibility, but it's not the most obvious solution at the moment. However, chord 1 has B flat, D and F in it, so it's looking likely that this is going to be a chord 1. So let's see what happens if I put a B flat in there. That's going to take up the last minim beat of that bar. That's going to give me chord 1 in root position. So I've got chord 1 followed by chord 5. Because this is root position and that's root position, we don't need to worry about putting any figures because they're both 5-3 chords. Now this means that we're very close to completing the first phrase. And I've done something that I'm going to demonstrate here on purpose. I've said try to get contramotion between the top and the bottom whenever you can. And you could carry on getting contramotion there. It'd be quite easy to do something like this, to have a D in the bass there, and then to have an E flat in the bass there. And if we did that, then we'd have to think about what this chord is. It's going to be a chord of B flat major, chord 1, B flat, D, F, because remember we need a chord that has F in it. But this D puts that chord in its first inversion, so we'd have to call that a 6. 6 abbreviating 6-3. If you want to consider the other possibilities, we've talked about chord 1 because F is the 5th of a chord 1. F is also the 3rd of a chord 3. Well, remember, chord 3 is possible, but it's one of the less likely chords to be used. Or it could be something to do with the root of chord 5. So those are all possibilities. The reason why I wouldn't choose a chord 5 there is this. If I had a chord 5, I'd have F in the bass followed by E flat in the bass. F, E flat is also in the tune, so if we went F in the tune and E flat in the bass, we would have blatant consecutive octaves. So 5 just really can't be used if we're going to have that chord after it. 3 is a bit unlikely, so 1 feels good. And to have a mixture of root position chords and first inversion chords works well. So we could do that. When it comes to this note, if this is keeping a bit of contramotion going, I've got E flat in the tune, and I've decided at the moment to treat that as the root position chord on E flat. E flat, G, B flat, which gives me chord 4 in B flat major. I could have gone for a chord 2 because E flat is the 3rd in chord 2. I could have gone for a chord 7 because E flat is the 5th in a chord 7. But chord 7 doesn't always work brilliantly, does it? So we have to be a little bit careful with chord 7. So in fact, chord 4 in root position would work fairly well. So if I do that, I'm going to leave it as a 5-3. The only other possibility that you might just consider here is to put a C in the bass. This is a slightly more risky possibility, but here it comes as a possibility anyway. And I'm going to put a 6 there. Now let's see what this actually means. If C is being used as a first inversion chord, then C must be the middle of a triad. So that's the 3rd of a triad, so the triad must be A, C, E flat. Now didn't I just say that that could be chord 7, and chord 7 is a chord we want to avoid? That's true. However, chord 7 works particularly well in first inversion. It doesn't work very well in root position, but it works well in first inversion. So you could have chord 7 in first inversion if you want to. Slightly risky because we're going down by step and we're going down by step here, so we've always got the risk of those consecutives looming. But if you're feeling ready to take that risk, there's a possibility. If you'd rather play it safer, move up to the E flat and call that a 5-3 chord. Okay, moving on to the next pair of bars, you might notice there's a sequence. Do you see these 3 notes are repeated a 3rd lower? So it could be that whatever pattern of chords we've got in this bar, it might just repeat in the next bar. We'll have a little think about that in a moment. B flat is the next note. B flat's the root of a chord 1, it's the 3rd of a chord 6, and it's the 5th of a chord 4. I'm going to suggest that we go for the chord 6. Not the only possibility, we could easily use one of the other possibilities, but it'd be quite nice at this point to have chord 6. Chord 6 is a minor chord, we've just had 2 major chords, and rather than go back to chord 1, because we just had chord 1 there, it just makes life a little bit more interesting. Why have we not got an asterisk on the 2nd beat of the bar, but we've got one on the 3rd beat? Because this C is a passing note. So I could just sit on a G, I suppose, because G, B flat and D, well there's B flat and there's D, but that would make the harmonic rhythm a little bit slow, wouldn't it? And we've got an asterisk anyway that's telling us to change the chord. So we've really got to change at the end of the bar just because the asterisk, but also just to keep the harmonic rhythm. It's changing on nearly every minim beat, isn't it? We've had 2 beats on this, so we probably need to shift on the 3rd beat. I'm going to suggest that we put an F in there. And you might wonder why I've gone for an F. Well, let's have a think about it. We've got D and we've got F. So those 2 notes are either the 3rd and the 5th of a chord 1, or they're the root and the 3rd of that chord 3. Slightly unusual chord. I didn't say we couldn't use it, but we're going to use it rarely. However, if the F is in the bass, then it's a chord 3B. So that is a first inversion chord. Again, not the only possibility, there are other things you could do, but let's put it in first inversion. So we'll write a 6, which is telling us it's an abbreviation for 6-3, first inversion. Now, we said this might be a sequence, so if that works there, and this is a 3rd below that, what happens if I put this bar here a 3rd lower as well? Let's just see if it works. Let's test it out. That was a 5-3 followed by a 6-3. Well, 5-3 here, E flat, G, B flat. Oh, that's handy, isn't it? E flat, G, that fits. Passing note, what happens if we then call that D in the bass a 6, a first inversion? Well, that's going to tell us that D is the third of a triad that contains B flat at the bottom and F at the top. It fits with the B flat, doesn't it? So 5-3, 6-3, 5-3, 6-3. It's just keeping our sequence going there, isn't it? And then we've just got one note left to put in. And we've got C in the tune. So if we've got C, C is the root of chord 2. C is also the third of a chord 7. And C is the fifth of a chord 5. So really, we've got chord 5 or we've got chord 2. I'm sort of thinking about avoiding chord 5 because 5 is just about to appear around the corner. So how about we go for a chord 2? We could either go for a 2 in root position. If I put a C in there, that will give me 2 in root position. Or we can have a 2B chord with an E flat in the bass. Maybe we'll go for that. There's an E flat in the bass, and we'll put it in first inversion. So that's one possible working of this kind of exercise. Let's hear what it sounds like if I play the top and the bottom and insert the missing notes of the chords. Seems fairly satisfying to me. Not the only possibility, but at least it gives you an idea how to work this kind of exercise.